Welcome to the Hermetic Astrology Podcast. I'm Gary Caton in Waynesville, North Carolina. You can find me on the web at dreamastrologer.com. And today is Friday, December 17th, 2021. And it is also Venus's hour. So Friday belongs to Venus, and Venus occupies the first hour of the day and also the, 8th hour of the day, right? Because there's 7 planets. So if we divide the 12 hours, if we divide the daylight time up into 12 hours, we get the various apportionments. So right now we have a Venus day, Venus hour, and Venus is in Capricorn, moving towards the midheaven, the local midheaven, very close to stationing retrograde, while also in conjunction with Pluto. And this is important for a few reasons. Well, for many reasons, but the main one being that Pluto is in a position very similar to that where it was at the time of the founding of the United States of America, in late Capricorn, just past its south node where it crosses the ecliptic plane in a downward fashion. And so the US Pluto return, you've probably heard a lot about. What you haven't probably heard about with that is that because Pluto and Neptune have a orbital resonance, you kind of can't get one without the other. In fact, all of us living today, most of us living today, are born under the Neptune-Pluto sextile. That's the one aspect that everyone has in their chart. And in fact, if we compare, as we're doing with the transit Pluto being conjunct the USA natal Pluto, we also have a situation where the transit Neptune is in opposition to USA Neptune. So really, it's, even though Venus is most obviously activating Pluto and Pluto is most obviously activating the USA, we can't think about all that without also thinking about Neptune, actually. And it's actually maybe even easier to see the influence of Neptune currently over the last several years. So that's the mundane context, mundane meaning mundos, world. Within a more local reference point, Venus and Pluto are making a conjunction near the place where Saturn and Pluto recently made a conjunction. And that conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in late Capricorn is considered to be, by many, what kicked off the whole pandemic and all that. We had a series of extreme stresses to the Capricorn structures, governmental, organizational, whether they be economic, supply chain, healthcare system. All the Capricorn systems of humanity have been stressed in a very big way by this pandemic. So the sign of Capricorn being, the focus of some heavy duty transits would be indicative of that. And Venus coming along to reactivate that would seem to bring about the next chapter in that whole story. So there's a broad historical context that is of the United States of America as a country, which is very Uranian, by the way. So we kind of have to bring Uranus in there a little bit if we're really going to do that justice. I'm not really going to go into all that. I just want to be clear that it's there. Don't really have time to address all of that at the moment. Just want to be clear the backdrop within which all of this is going on, right? And yet, when I consider the cycle of Venus and the sun together by itself, what's also known as the synodic cycle of Venus, it lasts about 584 days. It's the most regular of all the cycles. It's like clockwork. You can count on it because Venus has an orbital resonance with the Earth, orbital resonance with the Earth, similar to how Pluto and Neptune have a resonance. Venus and the Earth have a resonance, and it's a very harmonious resonance, and it's very steady, stable. And so Venus makes these conjunctions with the sun in 5 different signs every 8 years. And so Capricorn is one of the 5 archetypes that Venus is pretty much regularly transforming. She just happens to be transforming it this time around, along with Pluto and Saturn. You see what I'm saying? So we can look back, in one sense, we can look back 8 years ago, right? Which, if we go to the exact conjunction of Venus and the sun, will be in the year 2022. So if we go back before that, would it be early 2014? So late 2013, early 2014, that if we go back to that time and see what was going on in our lives with respect to the significations of Venus, which are love and romance and values, artistic creativity, etc., we can get some idea of the kinds of things to expect in general. But then on top of that, there's this whole mundane lens that is sort of, and it's interesting because on the one hand, I think it's absolutely valid and maybe even necessary at some point to just say, exclude that mundane situation for a moment and just say, I'm going within, I'm going to the inner worlds, and I'm going to tune out all of that noise, and in an attempt to kind of access a more truly spiritual dimension. And I think that's an absolutely valid way of doing it, but it's really hard to do. And I think that we can, maybe if we're careful and really good, we can actually sort of travel between the interior realms, and then noticing the correspondences between the macrocosm and the microcosm, noticing that, oh, when I do the interior work, when I take my respite from them, and I go and I notice this going on, and then I come back out into the world and I see that going on, is there a relationship? So yeah, I won't necessarily be able to get into that, but just want to point out the backdrop against which all this is happening, and it's rather profound. When I look at the Sun Venus conjunction, it happens at a time when Venus is passing between the sun and the earth, right? So Venus is as close to the earth as she can get. And for a lot of people, this is considered to be the inception or the starting point of the cycle. And so it seems to be like what I would refer to as a seed moment, or a reseeding moment, or a time to reset or renew our relationship with things Venusian. And in that respect, if I look back at the mythology, the associated mythology, the myth that seems to be most appropriate for me is, well, first of all, the myth of Inanna, the entire mythos of Inanna is one that can be applied to the planet Venus. And in fact, the mythology of Inanna is some of the earliest mythos that we have. Diane Wolkstein and Samuel Noah Kramer published a book, Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, Her Stories and Symbols, her story and hymns from Sumer. That is an academic and also artistic translation of some of this oldest cultural material that we know of from the dawn of humanity, the dawn of recorded history, recorded civilization. And so I want to read this myth to you, but I want to read it in the context of understanding that I had the privilege and honor recently of previewing a book that's coming out by John Michael Greer called The Twilight of Pluto. He asked me to write a blurb for it, and I was really very happy to do so. And one of the things, and I can't say too much about it because, I don't want to spoil the surprise or, ruin his party or whatever. But one thing that I think is really important to point out about that is he says that in attempting to contextualize what Pluto represents, he says, look, we have to take the discovery of Pluto and understand it within the context of all planetary discoveries. And he says, so what the situation is that, for a long time, humanity was aware of the sun and the moon and the stars. And then at some point, we have the discovery of the 5 visible planets, these wandering stars that, and essentially the discovery of these 5 visible planets this is me paraphrasing him, but he's basically saying that the discovery of these 5 visible planets is the Big Bang of civilization as we know it. In that this is the thing that sets apart the early civilizations of the Middle East from the others, is that we have these 5 planets, and we have these, Saturn as the planet of agriculture, and Mercury as writing and astrology and so forth, and Venus with arts and so on, right? So that the reason I bring this up is that it's important to understand Inanna, rather than get into this discussion of matriarchy versus patriarchy. I think for me, because a lot of feminines, well, not a lot necessarily, I have seen at least one feminine scholar speak about the myth that I'm about to read you in ways that, where she seemed to be very, offended by it and so on. And I totally get that. And I'm not saying that's not a valid point of view, but for me, I think a more valuable way of looking at it is as that Inanna is a goddess of civilization, of agricultural society, of the Neolithic revolution, essentially, and that rather than belonging to a culture of herding people, for instance, or a culture of hunter-gatherers, she belongs to a culture of farmers, agriculturalists, and indeed to the kind of civilization that evolved through various, to the Egyptians and the Sumerians, to the Greeks, and to the Romans, and so on down the line to us. So it really is very much the first dawning of a kind of organization, Capricornian organization of human society that looks like what we do today. You see, and it's important to understand that, I think, in order to understand the myth that I'm about to read you. And so without further ado, I'm going to get to that. In the first days, in the very first days, in the first nights, in the very first nights, in the first years, in the very first years, in the first days when everything needed was brought into being, in the first days when everything needed was properly nourished, when bread was baked in the shrines of the land, and bread was tasted in the homes of the land, when heaven had moved away from earth, and earth had separated from heaven, and the name of, I'm going to say, human was fixed, when the sky god An had carried off the heavens, and the air god Enlil had carried off the earth, when the queen of the great below, Ereshkigal, was given the underworld for her domain, he set sail. The father set sail. Enki, the god of wisdom, set sail for the underworld. Windstones were tossed up against him. Hailstones were hurled up against him. Like onrushing turtles, they charged the keel of Enki's boat. The waters of the sea devoured the bow of his boat like wolves. The waters of the sea struck the stern of his boat like lions. At this time, a tree, single tree, an Huluppu tree, was planted by the banks of the Euphrates. The tree was nurtured by the waters of the Euphrates. The whirling south wind arose, pulling at its roots and ripping at its branches, until the waters of the Euphrates carried it away. So I'm going to pause there in the reading and try to go back and look at a few things here to see if we can understand what's going on. So first of all, we're very clearly talking about a cosmology, a Genesis story, if you will, in the very first days, right? When everything needed was brought into being. When bread was baked in the shrines of the land. You see, so this is very clear reference to early agriculture. And then we have this separation of the one into the two, right? Which is the first primal division of earth and sky. And so we're talking about here a very primal, archetypal division. And then there's various gods that are associated with the this process. Ereshkigal is associated with the below, specifically, and Enki is on this journey to the underworld. And he's on a boat traveling to the underworld, and at the same time, there seems to be this storm that tears this tree and carries it down the river. And this tree could be conceptualized as what is called the world tree. The world tree is sort of like the axis mundi. It's the connection between, it's the thing that connects this division between the earth and sky, right? The tree is the thing that connects those. So there's this, so the tree is this divine connector between the heavenly realms and the earthly realms. And for this to be torn and carried in what way is potentially chaotic, and we can see that there in fact there's a storm that's going on, and in fact that is exactly the way that we often think about the process of retrogrades in astrology. There's this chaotic, and in fact planet doesn't simply go back and forth, it goes in these looping motions. And it's the absolute most chaotic motion that a planet can make, is this looping motion that it makes during retrograde. So there's now, it's also possible to conceptualize, if we think about that, the world tree, it's also possible to conceptualize this as this tree that is the 7 planetary spheres. That the planetary spheres represent this tree or this ladder that between the earth and the divine, that there's these 7 intermediary spheres in between. And it could also possibly be analogous to the 7 chakras of the human body. And yes, I know there are various other numbers that we could put on there, but 7 is one that happens to be very sacred. So we could think of this in cosmological terms, but also in very personal terms, right? So there's this storm, there's this there's this God that's traveling to the underworld, and there's the storm. So when we pick up our story, it says, a woman who walked in fear of the word of the sky god On, who walked in fear of the word of the air god Enlil, plucked the tree from the river and spoke, I shall bring this tree to Uruk. I shall plant this tree in my holy garden. Inanna cared for the tree with her hand. She settled the earth around the tree with her foot. She wondered, how long will it be until I have a shining throne to sit upon? How long will it be until I have a shining bed to lie upon? The years passed, 5 years, then 10 years. The tree grew thick, but its bark did not split. Then a serpent, who could not be charmed, made its nest in the roots of the Huluppu tree. The Anzu bird set his young in the branches of the tree, and the dark-maid Lilith built her home in the trunk. The young woman who loved to laugh, she wept. How Inanna wept, yet they would not leave her tree. So I'm going to pause here. This is really very interesting. So in the first part of the story, we have this separation of the earth and sky, and we have this storm, and this tree, this connector between this primal division is ripped away from its foundations and it's carried down the stream. And in the second part of the story, we have this young princess who rescues the tree, and she cares for it. She plants it in her holy garden, and then she wonders how long it will be until this tree can provide for her the things that she needs. She specifically wants a throne and a bed, and it takes time. It takes 5-10 years before the tree grows. And then we see that there are 3 beasts that come up. Well, 3 beasts and a spirit, perhaps, or I'm not sure what we would call Lilith. There are 2 beasts and another sort of. These 3 things are similar in that they would represent forces that are associated with the wilderness and not civilized. They're uncivilized, if you will. You see, so there's these 3 uncivilized forces that take up residence in her tree. And in the commentary in the back, I think Diane Wolkstein talks about that these represent Inanna's fears and her desires and so forth. And there's also this idea that they could represent rival deities or rival religions that would have been taking up residence in her city, Uruk, right? That and I think, you know, either interpretation could be true. So again, we have on the mundane level, there are these rival that religions that would be perhaps more involved in primal Dionysian, you know, ecstatic, mystical processes rather than more rational and civilized kind of behavior, you see. So there's also this, in this part, there seems to be this sense of that, that of the process of manifestation. So Inanna, there's this great storm, and the storm loosens the tree, which represents this connector between the earth and sky, but it also represents sort of the primal, the resource, the source of manifestation. And so so she is opportunistic. She rescues the tree from this transitory liminal state. It's in between, you know, and she cares for it. So there's this need to be receptive and able to respond, responsibility. But there's also this need for caring and nurturing, and there's also this need for patience and to wait. She knows that she will have to wait. So there's this. So it seems to be telling us that the process of manifestation consists of several things. That one has to be aware and observant and responsible, able to respond, and receptive, and particularly in times of crisis. You see that there is an opportunity within that crisis. If we are observant and responsive, we can receive something which may not have been available otherwise. You see, and then we have to be nurturing and take care of this thing, and then we have to have patience and wait. So there's this process of manifestation that seems to be spoken about, that I see here. So then there's these in the process of waiting, these other forces enter in, which seem to be counter to the desires of Inanna. They seem to be antithetical and or at odds with what she wants. If these forces are taking up residence in her tree, then the tree can't be used for the purposes that she wants it to be. So there's this, in the process of waiting, this passive sort of waiting, there's this something happens where this tension of these opposing forces enters the scene. We have a snake, an Anzu bird, and a Lulutu, or a Lilith figure. And so now this is anybody who is familiar with any kind of shamanic worldview. This is in shamanic worldview, there are three worlds. There's the upper world and the lower world and the middle world, right? And so the upper world is typically thought of as sort of like, this would be analogous to what Plato called the forms, you know, or Pythagorean, you know, ideals of the organizing structures that give form to the universe. This is the upper world is sort of associated with those. So the Anzu bird would be associated with these kind of things. And the serpent would be associated with desire for sure, and also power. And the lower world is a source of sort of chthonic. There's wealth and power that comes from the lower realms, but also like there's soul. There is the fiery ability to animate our world, to lay claim to the things that we want, and so forth. And then the Huluppu, I would say the Huluppu, to me, the Huluppu represents sovereignty, actually. Because Lilith was, by definition, what differentiates her from Eve, Adam's second wife, is that she was not willing to be submissive to Adam. So she was set apart. So there's this human beings are by definition communal beings. We evolved to live in tribes and bands and so forth, like as apes, we need that security and safety of numbers and so forth. But there's also this independent streak where we need differentiation, and we need that. But from point of view of the group, that's a problem because if somebody is too individual, they represent a threat to the cohesion of the collective. You see, so it's easy to see why that independence and sovereignty would be. It's fine if you're the queen, but if you're not, now you don't play well with others. When in fact you play well, you play just fine as long as they're not trying to dominate you or control you or whatever, right? So that's the way that I see the Lilith figure. And that's why it seems to be an uncivilized force, in the sense that it's independent. It doesn't want to be controlled or dominated or subjugated. If it's okay to use an it there instead of a he or a she, rather. Yeah, so rather than necessarily fears, I see these as powers. They're powers that belong to Inanna, but she's just becoming aware of her power. And when we first become aware of our power, it can seem scary. So it is a fear in a sense, but it's not necessarily her fears as in just this negative thing. It's her fear and naivete vis-a-vis her own power, essentially. And it's uncivilized in the sense that she hasn't yet learned how to control it or to master. She's not yet the master of it. And this is a very human situation when we're young, So the next part of the story, it says, as the birds began to sing at the coming of the dawn, the sun god Utu left his royal bedchamber. Inanna called to her brother Utu, saying, "Oh, Utu, in the days when the fates were decreed, when abundance overflowed in the land, when the sky god took the heavens and the air god the earth, when Ereshkigal was given the great below for her domain, the god of wisdom, Father Inki, set sail for the underworld, and the other world rose up and attacked him. At that time, a single tree, a Huluppu tree, was planted by the banks of the Euphrates. The south wind pulled at its roots and ripped at its branches until the waters of the Euphrates carried it away. I plucked the tree from the river. I brought it to my holy garden. I tended the tree, waiting for my shining throne and bed. Then a serpent who could not be charmed made its nest in the roots of the tree. The Anzu bird set his young in the branches of the tree, and the dark-maid Lilith built her home in the trunk. I wept, how I wept, yet they would not leave my tree. Utu, the valiant warrior, Utu, would not help his sister, Inanna. So here we have Inanna crying out for help. And this is very interesting to me in the sense of, if I were to draw parallels to the Hermetic cosmogony, in the beginning of the Hermetic, when there's this division between above and below, it's also between light and dark. In fact, the darkness comes out of the light, and then the darkness cries out to the light. Now, this is not to say that Inanna is dark as in evil or anything like that, but dark as in passive. She's waiting, right? So she's waiting and she's crying, right? And she cries out to the light, which is the sun god, Utu. So she's crying out for help. And there's this, there's this process of trying to cross this abyss between the above and the below. You see, trying to cross this abyss between the material and the divine, and then this crying out with our soul for help, for assistance, right? She's crying out specifically to the divine. Her brother is the sun god. He won't help her. Doesn't say why, it just says he won't. So next in the story it says, as the birds begin to sing at the coming of the second dawn, Inanna called to her brother Gilgamesh, saying, O Gilgamesh, in the days when the fates were decreed, when abundance overflowed in Sumer, when the sky god had taken the heavens and the air god the earth, when Erishkigal was given the great below for her domain, the god of wisdom, Father Inki, set sail for the underworld, and the underworld rose up and attacked him. At that time, a tree, a single tree, an Huluppu tree, was planted by the banks of the Euphrates. The south wind pulled at its roots, and ripped at its branches, until the waters of the Euphrates carried it away. I plucked the tree from the river. I brought it to my holy garden. I tended the tree, waiting for my shining throne bed. Then a serpent, who could not be charmed, made its nest in the roots of the tree. The Anzu bird set its young in the branches of the tree, and the dark-made Lilith built her home in the trunk. I wept, how I wept, yet they would not leave my tree. Gilgamesh, the valiant warrior, Gilgamesh, the hero of Uruk, stood by Inanna. Now, it's important to point out at this point that Gilgamesh is either mortal or semi or a demigod. He's either, but he's not a god. So Inanna has turned from the above to the below. She's turned from asking the gods for help to asking humanity, essentially. Maybe even we could say her devotees, if you will. She's turned to humans for help, and specifically the great hero Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh answers. Now, this is the point where the one feminist, I think rightly so, made a point that, oh, so Inanna is so helpless that she needs a man to do everything for her. Well, I can see how that would be offensive, and especially to a modern woman. But I think we could also look at it as that this is Inanna's, in Jungian terms, we would call it the animus, right? The masculine side of the woman. So that she had previously been waiting, passively waiting, so she and nurturing and caring, right? And now it's necessary to call upon her yang, masculine side, to act and to, and so we have this we could say that this is characteristic of the need for the sacred marriage, the inner marriage between the masculine and the feminine within Inanna, that she has to call upon and own her own, right? She's not getting help from above, she's getting help from below. So she's calling upon her own assertive nature to integrate that with her. And it would make sense as a female that she would be socialized into the feminine nature first, and she would only later and through some difficulty encounter the opposite side of her nature, vice versa for men, right? So I think that's another way of seeing it. Not saying the other way isn't right or isn't valid or maybe more valid than, but I think another way of seeing it is that this is speaking to the process of heros-gamos, the sacred marriage within an individual. So the next in the story, it tells us Gilgamesh fashioned his armor of 50 minas around his chest. The 50 minas weighed as little to him as 50 feathers. He lifted his bronze axe, the axe of the road, weighing 7 talents and 7 minas, to his shoulder. That's a lot of weight, by the way. He entered Inanna's holy garden. We could make sexual references maybe there, I don't know. Gilgamesh struck the serpent who would not be charmed. The Anzu bird flew with his young to the mountains, and Lilith smashed her home and fled to the wild, uninhabited places. So you see here, the Anzu bird flew to the mountains, and so we're talking about the difference between the civilized and the uncivilized, clearly, because where do they go? They go to the wild places, right? So we're talking about this difference between the civilized and the wild, and the sort of the tamed and the untamed, if you will. Then Gilgamesh loosened the roots of the Huluppu tree, and the sons of the city accompanied him, cutting off the branches. From the trunk of the tree, he carved a throne for his holy sister. From the trunk of the tree, Gilgamesh carved a bed for Inanna. From the roots of a tree, she fashioned a puka for her brother. I think that's some kind of ball. From the crown of the tree, Inanna fashioned a miku for Gilgamesh, the hero of Uruk. So we can see here that there's an exchange, that that Gilgamesh comes to help, and he helps Inanna procure the things that she had wanted from the beginning. He helps, and in return, she carves him something as well. So there's an exchange. There's a reciprocity that's going on here. And so I think this speaks to that process that I was calling of the sacred marriage, that each gets something out of the deal. And so there's a kind of union that happens where there's a wholeness that was not achievable before. Now, what's interesting about this particular cycle with Venus is that after Venus turns retrograde, she disappears and she becomes invisible, and then she reappears as morning star. And when she does, she will join with the planet Mars in Capricorn. Now, this doesn't happen every time. Venus joins with Mars. Really, there's a series of 5 meetings where Venus joins with Mars in the early morning sky, and then later in the morning sky, and then either in the underworld or and then in the evening sky, so that it takes 5 times for Venus and Mars, the meeting of Venus and Mars, to come around through the full cycle, visual cycle of Venus. And that happens over the course of 6.5 or 7 years. And so it's very interesting to me that at this particular time Venus meets Mars, because Mars, Gilgamesh was the warrior. And so it seems to me that this particular part of the myth is particularly relevant to the actual astronomy of what we're going through. That there's this storm and there's this tree that was previously located in one place, and it is uprooted in the storm, and it changes location. That is often interpreted. Remember, the tree was in Sumer, and now she's taken it to Uruk. That's often interpreted as the transfer of political power from one city to another. And so it's very interesting in terms of Mundos. We could say that, that this whole storm that we're seeing right now, has political parallels, in that there's an attempt, at least at this time, to change the balance of political power that's going on. And there, whether or not that is actually happening, or how and in what direction it's actually happening, it is very much a point of contention. So I'm not going to get into the specifics of it, but we can certainly see that that there seems to be a parallel here. For instance, even with just one thing that we can address is, like, economically, the power of the dollar as the de facto reserve currency. It's starting to be challenged in various ways, whether it is by people doing oil sales in the euro or other currencies. That was part of what that whole war in the last decade was about, whether it be cryptocurrency representing a challenge to the dollar, and from various, there's these various alternatives that are being, put out there now. Whether or not that will result in a shift of power from one place to another, we don't know yet. But we can see the storm, and we can see the possibility of that shift for sure. It's definitely there. And so that's interesting. And so on a personal level, what I would say is, like, okay, where does my, first of all, where is my center located, right? Where is the center of my value system located, right? What are the primary values because these things shift over time. We talked about that last time, and Venus is very much about values, and what is it that I want, right? Wanting, desire. This is very much a Venusian. Remember, Inanna gets the tree because she wants to manifest something. She has specific things that she wants. And so what is it that I want? And, what are the values that define my center? And these kind of things, these kind of questions might, within this storm, perhaps an opportunity presents itself and it might be that we end up, grabbing hold of something that we didn't even know we wanted, but as it presents itself, we realize, oh, this thing could be the source, could be a possible source for these things that I've been wanting, right? If we're opportunistic, we say, oh, wow, and we can grab that, plant it, and nurture it, and so forth. So, yeah, I think this myth is a very, very poignant and powerful parallel to the process of Venus turning retrograde and going through the underworld and then being reborn as the morning star, particularly with respect to the balance between the masculine and the feminine. In the I Ching, the first two hexagrams are called force and field in one interpretation, right? So we have, force and field. So force is like, the masculine, the yang, and field is like the feminine, the receptive. I remember one of my favorite movies that talks about this is the Legend of Bagger Vance, which is a pretty blatant interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, the sacred text, the sacred Hindu text, right? Because the hero in the Bhagavad Gita is Arjuna. The hero in Legend of Bagger Vance, his name is Randolph Juna, Arjuna. Okay, so it's pretty obvious what they're doing there, and in fact, Krishna appears in the Bhagavad Gita as a how does God appear? This is interesting. God appears as a chariot driver. He's the Uber guy. Right? And he says, and they have this dialogue, and eventually Krishna reveals himself as God and says, hey, Arjuna is hesitant to go to war because he will have to fight his cousins, his family. He says, I can't do this. I can't go to war with my own family. This is no good, huh? And Krishna says, hey, you are a warrior. This is your dharma. This is what you do. You have to keep being who you are, or the whole thing's going to break down. I'm going to have to come in here and do divine intervention to keep things turning. Like it's literally that the divine brings the material into manifestation, but it is the dharmic practice and the devotion of humans to the divine that reciprocates this process of creation. That's my interpretation of that, which, hey, feel free to argue with it if you want, or instruct me or enlighten me, if you wish. But that's just a very broad, general understanding of the situation there. At any rate, getting back to the force in the field. So in the movie, Randolph Juna is a former golf star who went off to the war and he had PTSD, essentially. He was traumatized by the war, and he had turned his back on golf, and really he had turned his back on the world, I'm just going to drink, and like, I'm not, he was not really interested in doing his dharma. He was not being who he was anymore, you see? And the town that he lived in was suffering alongside him. So there's a parallel to, like, for instance, in the Grail legend, where when the king is sick, the sickness is reflected in the land. And you can see this in that movie too, that and this young lady, I forget the name of the character in the movie, but she's trying to organize a golf tournament to revitalize the local economy and the local culture and so forth. And her and Juna had been, intimate before, but they had, part of him turning away, he turned away from love also. And so he agrees to take part in this tournament, but he's only able to, in cutting himself off from the world, he's cut himself off from his feminine side. You see, he's only able to, and the caddy, Bagger Vance, who is, in my view, analogous to Krishna, I suppose. He's kind of like the Uber driver. He's carrying the bag. He's the charioteer, what have you. He says, hey, you're just hacking at that ball like you're chopping weeds out from under your porch, man. He says, that ain't going to cut it. He says, you got to learn to see the field. And Juna says, I see the field. It's 180 yards. It's like, give me the club. Stop it with that, man. Stop it with that nonsense. He says, okay, and then he comes back and he says, okay, tell me about the field. And Bhagavan says, you've got to be able to feel the tides turning and feel the sun, caressing the grass, and to contextualize the force, the yang, within the context of the greater whole that contains it, the field. And it's only when you can apply the force within that wholeness of the field that you can direct the force in a way that will produce the results you're looking for. It's a beautiful clip. If you want to see, check it out on YouTube, just Bagger Vance Seeing the Field or whatever. It's really a beautiful clip. And so I think that this sacred marriage of yin and yang, of force and field, and of being able to seize what we want, to apply ourselves in an aggressive, assertive way, but within the context of a more holistic, nurturing, caring, receptive, connected way, right? So that it's not toxic, that it's not unbalanced, but it's actually whole. That's essentially what the point is of this passage. And it may even be that that's the most we can do to save the world, air quotes. Any kind of saving deserves air quotes right away, because there's this sort of victim savior dynamic that gets set up there. But in other words, now I'm not dissing activism or saying that, being involved in the world is not of use or is good, but I think an equally valid path is the one that I'm talking about, which is mostly internal and spiritual. That is rebalancing the yin and yang forces within ourselves. Jung said that, this process of individuation, like the first thing that you encounter is the shadow. And so the snake and the Anzu bird and the Lilith would be representatives of the shadow. And then we have to embrace and accept the shadow. We have to integrate the shadow first before we can then integrate the anima or animus, which results in true individuation, you see. And in many of these stories, the hero or heroine doing that personal integration has an effect on the world around them, that as they heal themselves, the world is healed, you see. And so it may be that that is the most that we can do actually to save the world, as individuals, we can't address all the problems of the world, not a chance. We'd be really lucky to successfully address any one of them. We'd be lucky and fortunate to be able to eventually address, with some success, any one of the problems that beset the world. But by trying to achieve some inner wholeness, we might be able to emanate a kind of wholeness that it has effects on all the problems of the world, you see? So with that said, I think some things to ask yourself during this Venus retrograde are, what is my linkage between the below and the above? What is my connection to the divine, and how is that? How am I centered? What is my axis mundi? And might there be, within this storm, an opportunity to see another way of doing that, another way of centering, another way of accessing the divine, of linking the above and the below, that is in flux, that I can grab onto and plant in my garden that that will help me to achieve the process of manifestation, of bringing into the world the things that I want. And or am I in the process of recognizing that this process of manifestation has started to bring me the things that I want, but there's these other forces that seem to be dark and negative, or at least contrarian, that I have to somehow engage to either tame or control or become masterful with, in order to balance the receptive and nurturing and the assertive and aggressive. How can I, am I in? How can I further that process? And it might be all of the above. But just being aware of this mythology, I mean, it's really, honestly, it's not that hard. Most of the time, it's astonishing to me how usually I don't really have to interpret for people. If I just tell them the story that I see in their horoscope or whatever, they go, oh, so this is this and that is that. Like, it's really usually pretty easy to see these parallels. If you have to try too hard, it's probably, not there. But if it is there, it's usually, pretty easy to notice. It might take a little bit of contemplation, only because this is not a way of thinking that we're usually once you see it, you go, oh, duh, it was there all the time. How could I miss that, right? In other words, it might not be easy to see, but it's usually pretty simple. It's pretty clear when you do see it. And so making these connections to this process of this goddess, and this process of manifestation, and this process of balancing the masculine and feminine within us, this would be, I think, a really, really rich metaphor to continue to reflect upon and to look for correspondences during this entire Venus retrograde. And on the other side of the retrograde, because Venus is starting her 584-day, 18-month cycle within the realm of Capricorn, and Venus and Mars together are starting a 6 to 7 year cycle in the realm of Capricorn. And these are personal planets. It seems to me that we have an opportunity here within this, what has been, outer planets are often very, very generational and very sociological, and they represent sometimes forces that are simply beyond our control. There's not a lot I can do about the fact that there's inflation or whatever. I mean, yes, I can vote. We can argue about whether that actually has any effect or not. But even if I do vote, I'm just one vote, right? So I only have so much power, even if we assume that voting has any effect. And so Saturn and Pluto coming together in Capricorn represents, to some degree, vast transpersonal forces that I just do not have any control over. So that's the storm, if you will. But the Venus having an 18-month cycle and Venus and Mars kicking off a 6 to 7 year cycle would represent now the time where the tree is coming down the river, and now I have agency. I can take this tree and plant it, and I can nurture it, and I can begin to focus on what I want, and I can begin to balance these forces within myself that are counter to what I want, and maybe blocking me from getting what I want, and in a way that I can bring them in harmony. I mean, in the myth, it says it drives these forces out. I don't know. I mean, perhaps there might be times where we literally have to do that. If life gets messy, and sometimes you have to defend yourself and so forth. And by all means, if that's what's called for, then that's what you have to do. But I think that's extreme. I think in some instances, it may simply be a process of balancing these forces as much as it is driving them off, so yeah, I've been wanting to do this for a long time. I used to do these, I used to work with Venus pretty much exclusively in the old days of the Goddess Astrology podcast. And then when I transitioned to the Hermetic side, there was a lot of other stuff that I wanted to do. And so I'm really happy to come back and look at this myth of the Huluppu Tree, because it's something that I've always thought was really powerful allegory for the process of creation, which is, always ongoing, right? It's not this thing that, yes, in the days that So yes, there was this, but that recapitulation of that creation story is what we do. We are made in the image of our creator. So we need to be creative, you see, and so we can recapitulate this process of creation all the time. And particularly, like I said, we have a new cycle, an 18-month cycle and a 6 to 7 year cycle, that right now the seeds are being planted for this longer term process of manifestation. And if we're paying attention, we might have some opportunities to really be able to manifest things over those time periods, by being attentive and seizing the opportunities that come along at this time, even in the midst of a storm that seems to be potentially tearing the world apart, you see. Wow, so we're past Venus's hour, but Venus has just passed the culmination point in the sky here, as I wanted to check and see, and so it feels like that's complete. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you keep tuning in. I'm going to try to check in with Venus throughout the cycle as we go along and talk about these. That's just one part of the whole mythology that goes along with Inanna. So there's the next chapter, if you will, is when Inanna goes to meet the god of wisdom, Enki. And I relate that to the morning sky when Venus is getting higher and brighter. She's seeking her power and she goes to see Enki. And so we'll talk about that early next year, and what that process represents and stuff. So yeah, it's good to be back with the goddess and talking about Inanna. It's just, God, she's so beautiful. And so Venus is so incredible in so many ways. And it feels really good to be getting back to my roots. And I'm really happy to be sharing that with you. So be on the lookout for more goddess astrology episodes, the return of the goddess in 2022. All right. Happy holy days, y'all. And bye for now.